The purpose of this lecture, let me begin by saying that what you are going to see and listen to is just a brief and, in a sense, arbitrary cut of what I understand as the neoclassical synthesis after the Second World War. And of course, you are invited to read further on these issues and eventually to contrast some of the ideas I'm trying to put forth in this presentation. So let me show you the overview of what I'm going to talk today. The first is just a very brief recap on John Maynard Keynes' main contributions to economic theory and the challenges that his works pose to the orthodox thinking, to the marginalist theory or neoclassical theory. I suppose that you have had a sort of good grasp on Keynes on Saturday's lecture by Professor Roncaglia, so I will be very brief on that. And then I will move on to the main topics of the talk, which covers the neoclassical synthesis, basically. And in that regard, I will specifically introduce, explain, and talk about different views on the so-called ISLM model. And so this is basically the core of this presentation. So the names of Sean Higgs, Modigliani, Samuelson, Patinkin, and other, Friedman, Lucas. So these economists of the 20th century, probably all of them having won Nobel Prizes at different years, and will come up at different parts of my talk. And also, I would like to introduce a sort of parallel theoretical development in neoclassical theory, which actually is the economic growth theory, put forth in the beginning by Robert Solow in 1956. And although I may say there is no an explicit connection between the neoclassical synthesis and the neoclassical growth theory, I think that there might be some space to make that connection. And I will try to say something about that connection, but basically the idea is to discuss how come this neoclassical growth theory eventually became the mainstream view on economic growth studies, and which were their purposes at that time. And in a sense, why is it that even today, neoclassical growth theory or exogenous neoclassical growth theories, as is well known, eventually is even today dominant, despite the different criticisms which were raised both by heterodox or alternative theories, but also within the same neoclassical framework by the so-called endogenous growth theorists in the 80s and 1990s, okay? So, and just as a way of provisional conclusion, on point 5, basically, I will give you a few remarks on the dominance of this neoclassical synthesis in macroeconomic studies and neoclassical growth model for economic growth studies, all right? So just to begin with the recap on Keynes' major contributions, in my reconstruction, I identified basically a few of the key contributions by Keynes. The first one is that the engine or the market system is the aggregate demand or the effective aggregate demand, right? So the economics problem is not about a way to allocate scarce resources in order to employ for alternative uses according to the different needs, as has been put forth by Lionel Robbins in the 1930s. For Keynes, the economic problem is how how a society can actually organize themselves in a way that can satisfy needs. But in a market system, if you don't have effective demand, it's quite impossible actually to have a process of economic growth and eventually to achieve a sort of full employment. Okay, so the key is effective demand. Then the second contribution, of course, in connection with the first one, is that market economies can show resting positions or equilibrium positions where we have unemployment or underemployment. So basically, we may have non-full employment equilibrium. Then one of the key mechanisms which Keynes introduced is connected with the liquidity preference, right? So basically, money is not only has not only the function to be a way to make transaction more fluid, but also money can be hoarded and therefore can be used as a way of reserve, and therefore it's not we cannot take it for granted that money will be used for making purchases. So basically, there is a problem of how to treat money on the part of the public, right? So basically, that is also another important contribution. And all of these contributions, in a sense, I think, speak of the fact that the supply and demand forces of the neoclassical or marginal theory actually cannot explain or cannot be used in order to explain a situation in which we have persistent unemployment, right? So, or underemployment or unemployment, okay? So, and this actually has been a very important challenge to orthodox thinking in the 1930s in a context, of course, of the economic crisis of the Great Depression of the time, and this, well, I mean, we would need probably another set of seminars to explain how Keynes' work eventually came about and the discussions in Cambridge at that time regarding their views on money and the connection with the output and employment, right? But the key thing, in my opinion, is basically the idea that even if wages can go down, right, because you have a sort of unemployment, so there is a labor force waiting for being hired, still, even if your wages go down, still your level of employment cannot go up. And this has to do with basically with institutional factors, right? And we will see right now precisely how the neoclassical theory actually attempted to absorb these Keynesian ideas, right, into the marginalist or neoclassical framework. Okay, and of course, the last point has to do with the public intervention. So, in a context of persistent unemployment, where prices, in a period of persistent unemployment, and when supply and demand cannot adjust, even if prices are flexible, then we need, says Keynes, we need some sort of public intervention, right? So these are basically the most, in my opinion, or the major contributions by Keynes. I mean, just in one slide, I am trying to summarize decades of economic theory and debates, and well, and about Keynes precisely. So it's quite a difficult task, of course. But just to, I want to point out just that the purpose of the so-called neoclassical synthesis was actually how to absorb those challenges posed by Keynes, by Keynes into the neoclassical framework. Okay. And this attempt was immediately put forth, or again, was tried out by immediately after the publication of Keynes' general theory. All right, so in 1937, Higgs, Harrod, and Mead contributed papers on how to, let's say, rewrite Keynes' main ideas, but they were put forth in a sort of formal model, which eventually will bring about the so-called ISLM model. Okay, so, and the main purpose of this neoclassical synthesis was the chance or possibility to achieve a sort of reconciliation between the Keynesian ideas and the Keynesian problems, which had been put forth by Keynes' book, and the basic neoclassical model. So in that attempt, the ISLM model was precisely the breakthrough of this compromise or of this reconciliation. Probably the starting point or the starting assumption was that all of these Keynesian problems regarding that supply and demand in the labor market cannot adjust are basically originated in the fact that they are all short-run problems. Okay, so the attempt was to incorporate the Keynesian insights, problems, and ideas, but by regarding them only to the short run. Okay, and amongst the contributors to this neoclassical synthesis, we have, as well as the economists that I already named, we have also Samuelson, Modigliani, Patinkin, but also we have Lange, for example, in 1938 he contributed. So we have a great number of economists, of renowned economists, working on this reconciliation between Keynes' ideas and the neoclassical theoretical framework. And of course, after the Second World War, this new synthesis actually became the sort of mainstream economic theory in terms of the macroeconomic theory, which started to be disseminated in the academia, but also it had a very huge impact on the economic policy circles in the West, at least, but I would say in the whole world, basically. And well, I suppose that most of you, if not all, are already somehow familiar with this ISLM model, because this is the benchmark model that is used in every macroeconomic textbook, either introductory or advanced, right? So, sorry. Okay, let's move to the analysis of the main or salient aspect of the so-called ISLM model, okay? So the idea basically is that the starting point is, of course, that is a mismatch between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So they recognize, the neoclassical synthesis authors recognize that supply doesn't meet with demand, right? And so we may have this imbalance between supply and demand. And the reason for this to be so is that, and this is ad hoc assumptions which are introduced into the neoclassical model, the reason is that we have the so-called sticky prices. So basically, that might be, that is the idea or the assumption, there might be some prices in the economy which actually prevent supply and demand from meeting at some point, right? So the prices, basically, some prices don't adjust. In particular, the emphasis was on the stickiness of a particular price, which are the nominal wages, right? So the assumption was that because of trade unions or other sort of regulations, there might be some wage rigidities, namely some obstacles which actually prevent wages from going down in a way that eventually, the theory says, supply and demand will meet each other, and therefore an equilibrium would be achieved. So this is actually the core of the ISLM model, namely to try to find some stickiness in some of the prices in some market, in particular in the labor market and in particular wages, right? And it is because of this sticky price, a sticky wage that prevent labor supply from meeting labor demand. Okay, so that is the assumption incorporated. Of course, this if we go to Keynes' original works, maybe we may find that actually his views on these so-called wage rigidities, right, or the fact that wages cannot go down beyond a certain minimum point, has to do with his preoccupations around social peace or social cohesion between different social classes in a given country or in a given economy, right? In particular, during periods of social and economic turmoil, as during the Great Depression, right? But this insight, which Keynes put forward for the first time, at least, was absorbed by these neoclassical authors by assuming that this means that we have some sort of rigidity in the wages. Okay, so you can ask or jump in at any point, because if there is anything which is not clear, I can go back to the point or make it clearer, hopefully. So feel free for that. And so let me, I think we have time. Yeah. Sorry if this is a little bit lengthy, but I would like to show you, the salient elements in the ISLM model, right? And in this presentation, I sort of used a hybrid between the contributions by Higgs, Modigliani, and Patinkin, basically, right? But the first one was Higgs, of course, and the basic model is a three-market general equilibrium model, where we have the goods market, the money market, and the bonds market. In a way, when you look at the goods market, we may say that this is a one-for-all commodity market, right? So we have a sort of aggregate commodity, or aggregate composed commodity, right? And because this is a sort of, this is actually, at least in Higgs reconstruction, I would say, but also in Patinkin, which was explicit on that, this was a general equilibrium model. And because of Barras's law, when you manipulate the model, you can actually put the bonds market apart from analysis, right? Because due to this Barras law, if you achieve the equilibrium in two markets, therefore the equilibrium will be achieved also in the third market, which is actually the market bond, right? So on the goods market, right? So we have the investment savings schedule, right? Which actually is, well, we might have some discussion regarding because Modigliani and Patinkin differed on this equilibrium, right? In the ISLM equilibrium, right? In terms of whether it was a monetary equilibrium or a real equilibrium, right? But in this hybrid, I take it, let's say, the Patinkin's reconstruction, in the sense that aggregate supply equals aggregate demand whenever investment meets with savings at all the possible positive values for the interest rate and the output. So the assumption is that the investment schedule will move inversely with respect to the interest rate, whereas the saving function will move positively with respect to the different levels of income or output, right? So that is why you have the first derivative of each function in the opposite signs. Okay, so this is basically the traditional IS curve. So on every point on that curve, you have would-be equilibriums, in the sense that for all the positive values of the interest rate, you will have different levels of investment being equal to savings, right? So however, when we incorporate the money market, we have to not only incorporate the money market and to say a few words about that, but then we will see how the goods market interact with the money market. Okay, so but the first things to say is that if we isolate the commodity market, we have an infinite number of equilibrium on this curve, all right? So all the points which actually compose this curve would be equilibrium points. So now if we move to the money market, to begin with, we must say that the money supply or money creation is totally exogenous according to the ISLM model, according to the neoclassical synthesis, all right? So we have exogenous money. There is no endogenous process of money creation. Although there have been some attempts of late, I would say in quite recent years, by rather post-Keynesian authors that try to incorporate endogenous money creation into an ISLM model. But this is, I mean, the traditional ISLM model, money is exogenous. And on the demand side, we have this reconstruction of Keynesian ideas, namely that we may demand money for transaction purposes, and therefore the demand for money will increase if the level of output and income increase. That is why you have a first derivative positive. And also we have the demand for money because of speculative motives, right? And in that case, the demand for money will move in the opposite direction of the interest rate, right? So, and that is, I mean, this is the basic LM part of the ISLM model, okay? So combining this information on the demand side of the money market, we arrived at this curve. Again, we have an infinite number of eventually would-be equilibrium points on every point on the LM curve for all positive or possible positive values of the interest rate, okay? So, how this model works and what are the mechanisms which may be adduced to in order to explain in a neoclassical way the Keynesian problems, okay? So the idea basically is if output or income is in a position with unemployment, right? So we may have some expansionary fiscal policies in order to increase income and output, okay? In the short run, of course, right? In the short run. And precisely because the neoclassical synthesis wants to make this result compatible with the basic neoclassical approach, the idea is that we have to introduce, or the model actually has to introduce some sort of non-competitive behavior in the labor market. For example, as in the case of Modigliani's contribution in 1944, where due to trade unions, the wages will not adjust freely and completely, right? So we have some non-competitive behavior behind the labor market, and that is why we have sticky wages, and that is why we have unemployment in the short run, okay? So, sorry. So under this scenario, right, of persistent unemployment or underemployment, we may have some expansionary policies from the fiscal side, right? So basically the government increases the public expenditure, for example, in consumption or government expenditure in investment. For public investment, the government can't build roads or buildings, whatever. And because of this increase in the public expenditure, this will, through the multiplier, in Keynesian terms, through the multiplier mechanism, may eventually give rise to an increase in investment, because there will be a higher level of demand for different sectors, which have been triggered by the initial increase in the fiscal or in the public expenditure, right? So you can see that, therefore, that this IS will move towards the right of this plot, of this diagram, right? And eventually we may have, the ultimate result will be an increase in the level of output from Y0 to Y1, okay? Actually, the process, the adjustment process, could be a little bit more cumbersome here, but the original thing is that if you keep the original, sorry, I missed to put here R0, right? But the original, or maybe the first impact at the R0 interest rate level would be a further increase of the income beyond Y1, right? But at that point, supply and demand of money, the money market wouldn't be in equilibrium at that point, right? Because if the output or the income increases beyond Y1, the demand for transaction will be higher than the supply of money, and therefore the interest rate will have to be increased from R0 to R1, and therefore the level of income will have to be reduced, right? So that is why eventually we end up with a with a higher level of income from Y0 to Y1, but also with a higher level of the interest rate, okay? But again, we have to bear in mind that all these mechanisms and adjustments occur according to the neoclassical synthesis only in the short run, okay? This is only valid in the short run for the neoclassical theory. Yes, for the neoclassical synthesis. Yes, so I suppose, we can, if you have some questions around the formal model or the different mechanisms, we can discuss later. So now let me briefly give you an overview of different variants and criticisms that the ISLM model received at different points in history during the 20th century. So the variation put forth by Patinkin, actually, probably in his book, he was probably the first one to try to provide the so-called micro-foundations in variation terms, in a sort of general equilibrium model, in order to back the macro model, the ISLM macro model, right? And basically he introduced explicitly the budget constraint of the agents and how the adjustments in the ISLM model respect or not these budget constraints, right? Interestingly, we may have some discussions around this, right? One of the salient results out of this ISLM model was the so-called Pigou effect or real balance effect, which was thoroughly analyzed by Patinkin, right? And the idea basically is that if we have this stickiness in the economy, right, in particular in the labor market, we may expect that if real wages are to be kept constant, then nominal wages eventually may fall, and therefore prices will fall. But at the same time, wealth or outside money, I mean money which is held without a debt counterpart, actually will increase its real value, in the sense that if you have some wealth edited from the past, for example, then as prices will go down, then your real value of those balances will be higher, and therefore this eventually would increase consumption. Well, there are some empirical studies showing that the effect of these Pigou effects or real balance effects are actually minimum or very, very tiny, right? Is there any question? Okay. Also, there are some differing views on the liquidity trap as well, because, for example, Modigliani says that liquidity trap arises out of an infinite demand for money at a minimum level of the interest rate, right? Whereas Patinkin says that a situation of liquidity trap may happen at any level of the interest rate, right? I mean, we can go further on that if you are interested. Okay. Now, then some other variants and other connection of the ISLM model. One of these connections, very influential in economic policy circles and in the macroeconomic in general, is the so-called Phillips curve. So basically, the idea is that if we have a certain process of economic growth out of these expansionary policies, right? We may expect some increase in the nominal wage level, and this may eventually create some sort of inflation. And out of this trend, Phillips, New Zealand, an economist from New Zealand, in a paper in 1958, put forth an inverse relationship or a trade-off which the economists can actually choose between unemployment and inflation. So basically, the economy may, by choosing different economic policies, the economy would be able to choose actually which level of unemployment and inflation the economy would be in. All right, but this development received some criticism from some neoclassical economists. Probably the most renowned on these criticism were the Milton Friedman, Edmund Phelps, and also Robert Lucas. In the case of Friedman, he said that actually this trade-off between unemployment and inflation could be a valid inverse relationship, only in the short run, right? Because in the long run, this vertical Phillips curve will be always vertical. According to Friedman, actually, the point is that he's a monetarist. So the main point is that any expansionary monetary policy will eventually push the economy to a higher level of prices, right? But it won't have any impact or any effect on the real side of the economy. Eventually, it may have some short-run effect, okay? That is on the part of the monetary policies. But what about the fiscal policies? Well, the monetarists actually disregard fiscal policies because they argue that it is quite uncertain, not only the choice of the economic policy that policymakers have to make when they analyze a certain situation, but also it's quite uncertain the very outcome, namely the impact of the different fiscal policies which were decided upon on the variables, on the targeted variables by the policymakers, right? That is why they disregarded basically any fiscal policy. So according to Friedman, only monetary policies could be implemented but these monetary policies would only have a short-run effect, and eventually the idea is that monetary changes will have effect on nominal variables, right? Wages and prices. And the second, and this is an extreme criticism put forth in the 1970s, especially by Lucas, and this is the so-called rational expectations critique of the model. And the upshot of this criticism is that basically we don't have Philip curves not only in the long run but even in the short run, right? So the Philip curve is always vertical because according to this rational expectations approach, the idea is that economic agents who hold the relevant economic theory, they can always anticipate any impact of the government policies, right? And therefore they will, if they have the correct and the relevant economic theory or economic models, they will be able to anticipate the effect, and therefore they will adjust in a sort of intertemporal setting the future impacts in terms of, for example, diminishing consumption or diminishing savings, okay? Let me also add, let's say, a methodological or epistemological note around this, because this is quite important. I mean, among other problems, of course, but one of these problems is that according to these rational expectations criticism, we have to assume that all of the economic agents hold or have the same economic model, all right, and that belong to the relevant theory, right? That is quite of a strong assumption, okay? And I wanted to point it out, right? Because I think that there are some epistemological and methodological problems in this rational expectation approach. Okay, so before going into the point 4 on the economic growth models, just to rekindle a long-standing debate in the history of economic ideas, which is if you want to put it succinctly, you may ask yourself, was there a truly Keynesian revolution after the Second World War, or was it actually an ISLM revolution? And I will not go into the details of the different authors, even Keynes himself, about this, but just to open a debate, hopefully among, here in this online class. But interestingly, Samuelson wrote in a paper in Econometric, I think it was published, that until the appearance of the mathematical models of Mead, Lange, Hicks, and Harrod, there is reason to believe that Keynes himself didn't truly understand his own analysis, right? So, in a sense, it seemed, or at least to me, that, in other words, actually, Keynes was totally absorbed into the neoclassical framework, right? And it was subsumed to the short-run analysis, and therefore, which was the actual contribution by Keynes, right, on his own, right? So, and the fact is that at the same time, I think we have to recognize that probably, or at least that was my case, I came to know Keynes and Keynes' work through learning the ISLM model first, right? So, I mean, from a historical point of view, in terms of the learning experiences of macroeconomics, there might be some truths of this, right? But again, this has only the the purpose to raise some debate or discussion here. Okay. Okay, so let me move to the other point that I wanted to present in this lecture today, and this regards the parallel developments in neoclassical theory. I mean, this word parallel, I mean, could be arbitrary. I mean, I don't know if it was parallel or together with the other developments, because Paul Samuelson was, of course, involved in both of these developments, both in the neoclassical synthesis and in these neoclassical growth models and neoclassical growth theory. Okay, but in any case, it is important to recall that the neoclassical theory after the war, the neoclassical theory attempted to provide some alternative to explain economic growth, to explain how to reconstruct the damages out of the war, and especially in the world of economic and political ideas in the new context of the so-called Cold War, right? So, and this, I think, is part of the, in my opinion, has to be put into the framework when we try to reconstruct historically the emergence and eventually the influence and big impact of the economic growth theories of the neoclassical theory. Also, it has to be mentioned that in my opinion, the contribution by Robert Solow and also Tibor Swan and other economists in the 1950s on was also to try to provide an alternative framework to Harrod-Domar, okay? Basically because there are some Keynesian elements in Harrod-Domar model, yeah, and also because, as you know, probably the Harrod-Domar model has some issues or problems regarding the stability of the equilibrium between the warranted and the natural growth rate, right? So, and in order to overcome this problem formally, Solow attempted to do that by actually assuming that capital and labor, or the relationship capital-labor, can be flexible, right? So the idea was that from the so-called Leontief technology, which we may envisage as the technological methods of production in Harrod-Domar, Solow will use a smooth production function, and therefore the possibility to substitute one factor for the other, okay? And well, this is, in this slide, I put for I mean, these are the main the main features of Solow model, right? So we have an aggregate production function, and precisely this is a continuous function which is saying to us that we can substitute different quantities of capital for labor, or different quantities for labor of labor for capital, according to the different situation in the distribution and price in the economy. All right. In a sense, I would say that Solow's model attempted a very elegant way of putting together the value and distribution neoclassical theory and the output theory, right? Because in a sense, he combined these, let's say, these two compartments of the neoclassical theory, and he managed to put it very elegantly in very few equations, And the result, which eventually the model achieved, is quite remarkable, right? Because of their impact that it had in the economic growth discussions in development, and also because of its applicability on empirical matters. So again, we have an aggregate production function, and therefore this function is depicting an infinite number of techniques, right? So we have factor substitution according to the different price and distribution situation. We have constant returns to scale. So basically this hypothesis is very, very important for Solov model, because he's saying that if output increased, so that increase in output will be distributed according to the marginal productivities of each of the factors that are contributing to that increase in the output, okay? Then population growth is assumed to be constant, and there is no technological progress, okay? So technology is exogenous in Solov's model, okay? And this will be precisely the core of the criticism raised by the so-called endogenous growth theorists. Okay, so here you have this constant return to scale production function, and because of this property, in other words, it is a homogeneous of degree 1 function, and you can apply the Euler rule, and therefore you can divide output and the factors by the quantity of labor employed in the economy, and then you get the output per capita function, okay? And the properties, the formal properties of the function don't change because of the assumption of constant returns to scale. So that is what you get, output per capita. That is one of the first relations of interest for Solov model. And the second relation is the relation between output and investment or capital accumulation. So basically you have, this is for discrete time, right? But you have capital per worker at two different periods, let's say this year and next year. So the difference between them on the left-hand side of the equation basically is indicating the investment which is necessary in order to cover the depreciation of the capital used during time t, right, which is the second term of the right-hand side of the equation, right? You have delta k over n, okay? And of course, this investment has to be equal to the savings of the economy, which is given by the propensity to save, which is the lowercase s, times the output per capita at time t, okay? So this is granted this output per capita function, then this second relationship is the key equation, the key relation, which is the key relation which Solov is interested in. So here we have in words. So you have the change in capital per worker, right, from 1 year to the next. So it has to be equal to investment, which is actually equal to savings, right? Because according to the neoclassical theory, savings equals investment, right? But you have to subtract the depreciation which occurs during that year, right? Which is given. Okay, we may have some problems regarding how you calculate the depreciation of fixed capital during year t, right? But I mean, I'm not going to enter into those technical details, if that was a correct way or not to calculate depreciation, because this is assumed to be constant by the coefficient delta, which is positive. So the idea is that basically we have, with this relationship, we can see what happens if the investment exceeds or is less than the depreciation per worker, right? So if the investment per worker, everything is per worker or per capita, is exceeding the depreciation, then we will have a change in capital per worker, in capital per capita, a positive change, and therefore capital per capita capital per worker or capital per capita will be increased. Okay, I will show you later the diagram of this relationship. On the other hand, if investment per worker is less than what is needed in order to cover depreciation, then the capital per worker will have to go down, okay, and it will decrease. But how these two mechanisms occur actually, or mainly, or basically, what are the mechanisms behind these two ways of adjusting capital per worker and capital accumulation or investment? So here we have the basic diagram and sort of model, right? So this is the relationship between the output per worker on the vertical axis and the capital per worker on the horizontal axis, right? So if we have in a point like depicted like point A, where we have a capital per worker level of K0 over N, so this implies that the investment per worker actually is exceeding the need for depreciation per worker, right? So you can see that the segment AC is greater than the segment AD, right? So we have a sort of, we don't have a balance, we don't have an equilibrium between investment and savings. And what he's saying here is basically that at that level of the interest rate, which is relatively low with respect to the price of the other factor, which is labor, the entrepreneurs, the firms, can actually move right towards the right and start to employ more capital-intensive methods of production, and therefore the capital per worker will be increased. Okay, and therefore we start moving from point C towards the point of equilibrium between depreciation per worker and investment per worker. And as we move towards that point, then on point B, which is depicting the output per worker, of course, this output per worker will be increasing because capital per worker is being increased and therefore output per worker is being increased. Okay, and this happens because at that price and distributive situation of point DCB, the thing is that the interest rate is relatively low with respect to the wage rate, and therefore the more capital-intensive methods of production will tend to be more optimal in a sense. They will be the optimal ones, and therefore they will be chosen, and therefore with these methods of production implemented, capital per worker will be increased, and therefore we will eventually end up in the equilibrium position. However, we can also see we can imagine, sorry, I didn't show it on the diagram, but if we imagine a point where the depreciation per worker is greater or higher than the investment per worker, at that point, capital per worker will have to go down, okay? Because that level of savings and investment is not enough, right? So capital per worker will have to go down. And how does the economy choose to diminish the capital per worker? Basically by switching or moving from capital-intensive methods of production to more labor-intensive methods of production, right? Because wages are relatively, or the price of labor is relatively lower than the price of capital, and then the disequilibrium situation of the economy will move towards the left, and eventually you can see that the equilibrium point, right, actually is a stable equilibrium, okay? And this was at that time a remarkable result, because if we compare it against Harrod and Domar's outcome, on the so-called knife edge equilibrium, right? This is a stable equilibrium, right? So any movement on the right-hand side or on the left-hand side of this equilibrium point, the factor substitution mechanisms will come into play, and therefore the economy will be able to adjust towards that equilibrium point. Okay, and this is the case also if the propensity to save is exogenally increased, right? So if the lowercase s that you have on this function, on the investment per worker, even if the propensity to save increases, then the curve will move up, right? We will have a new curve, and the old point will indicate that the investment per worker is greater than the depreciation, and therefore we'll have a new and higher level of the output per worker and capital per worker. Okay? In words, sorry. So when capital and output are low and investment is exceeding depreciation, so capital will be increased by employing more capital intensive methods of production, because the interest rate was relatively low in the first place, right? So, and this is precisely the moment in which Solow is combining production neoclassical theory and neoclassical theory of value and distribution, right? So because it is thanks to the different possibilities to choose between different methods of production that firms, entrepreneurs, etc., can adjust the quantity of factors employed according to the relative scarcity of those factors, right? And so, and on the other hand, if capital output are high, the investment is less than depreciation, and therefore capital will have to decrease by employing less capital-intensive method. In other words, more labor-intensive method of production, which will make the capital per worker lower. Okay. So, as a way of conclusion of this Solow growth model, right? The economy will eventually achieve a steady state capital and output per capita levels, okay? And this can be actually generalized and can be implemented, this approach, to study any economy, all right, any economy. The only divergence between different countries and different economies would be that they will have different, or they will be displaying different levels of the endowments, okay? Different quantities of labor or technology or taste and preferences on the consumers and so on and so forth, right? But the direction of the movement of this mechanism of adjustment between the employment of factors, right, and the steady state capital and output per capita levels, the movement, the direction of this adjustment will be the same, right, for different countries. For example, if you combine, I mean, this was already done, of course, Solow model with for international trade with the Heckscher-Ohlin model, right? So the idea is that if a developing country or a poor country which is more relatively endowed with labor rather than capital, then this country will have to specialize itself in the production of the commodity, which requires more intensively the factor of production the country is endowed with the more, okay? So the same thing, or symmetrically, you can apply that principle to a rich country or an industrialized country, developed country, which has more capital, right? So it is endowed with more capital than labor, and therefore it has to be specialized in the production of the commodity or service, whatever, which requires more capital than labor. So eventually, these countries will converge to the same steady state growth of capital and output per capita, independently of the, okay, they may differ in terms of the level, but the direction of the movement will be the same, because the explanation basically relies on this combination of relative scarcity of factor of production and techniques of production. Okay, so eventually we always will be able to find that method of production which will be optimized, right, according to the scarcity of factor of production, and of course according to the price and distribution situation of the economy. So it is no wonder that this model was very influential, right, in not only in industrialized countries but also in some development economies, I would say. And however, this model has some problems, some of which we are going to talk in the next lecture on Saturday. And this regards the issue of the use of the aggregate production function, but also this fact, right, these points A and B, which I wrote here, namely this assumption that the factor substitution principle also works for capital and labor. Okay, so let me conclude out of this presentation that of course by the 1940s, 1950s, this so-called neoclassical synthesis was dominant in macroeconomics. I would say that still today, I mean, this ISLM model is probably the most influential way to learn and teach macroeconomics. Probably, or maybe we can add nowadays that in macroeconomics, we have had some recent developments, like the so-called, how you say, the stochastic, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, right, which have been introduced into the macroeconomic literature. But basically, still the ISLM model is the benchmark in the macroeconomics macroeconomic theory. In a way, it has been successful and in the terms of how they managed to incorporate and absorb Keynes' insight into the neoclassical framework, into the supply and demand framework. That is, I mean, this is quite of an interesting historical thing. I mean, and there are, you know, scores of papers and books around this issue, of course. And regarding the neoclassical growth theory, or the so-called exogenous growth theorist of Solow, Swan, etc., this approach became the mainstream in growth studies in the 1956, 1950s onwards. And even today, I mean, despite all the criticisms raised by the post-Keynesian theorists, but also by other neoclassical theorists like the so-called endogenous growth theorists, Rebello, Lucas, etc. Even today, I would also argue that in terms of the mainstream, I think that the Solow growth model still is dominant for economic growth problems, for economic growth studies, right? Despite the fact of these problems and criticisms raised, especially in the 1960s, and then within the neoclassical theory during the 1980s and 1990s. Okay, so I don't know if I am on time. Thank you, everyone, for listening.